Today, many stories of the prisoners of the concentration camps during the Second World War have not been told. Millions of people who were forced into camps such as Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz never made it out alive and succumbed to the evil conditions that they were kept in. When the Allies liberated sites such as Auschwitz and Sachsenhausen, they came across true hell on earth, with death lurking around every corner. But the stories from the survivors later came out, and many told of the evil and barbarism inflicted upon them. It was clear at certain camps that the idea was for the prisoners to be worked simply until they died, being given very little food and water, and if they did not work hard enough, they were executed. Many executions took place at sites across the Third Reich, and many were performed in quiet. A number of female spies who worked for British SOE were executed quietly, but following the war their stories were uncovered. There is one story which is not well known, and it is of a French princess, a member of the aristocracy, who joined the French resistance to take the fight to the Nazis and the Germans. But inside of Ravensbruck Concentration Camp, Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay never made it out alive. Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of the French Princess of Ravensbruck, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay was born on the 1st of April 1919 inside of France, and she was a daughter of Pierre de Alcantara de Beauffremont, who was the Prince Duke of Beauffremont-Courtenay. This was a prestigious French family which had a long history dating back centuries. The Beauffremonts were members of the nobility, and many of them were involved in key historical events. For example, Nicolas de Beauffremont and his son Claude were part of the Estates General, and they spoke out politically, and also on the 8th of June 1765, Louis de Beauffremont was made a Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, and this was a title recognised in France. The title of Prince de Courtenay is still given out to this day, and one of the descendants, Alexandre Beauffremont, fled during the French Revolution and made his way to America before he returned and was made a Count of the French Empire by Napoleon, and he was then even made a peer of France by the King. So the family had rich ties in the French nobility, but Anne made history in a different way. Her mother was Thérèse Chevrier, and it's likely that as a child she was given the best form of education that money could buy in France, as the family were very wealthy. It's also possible that her family would have imagined marrying her off to a wealthy European prince in order to secure further wealth for the family and also status around the world. However, as the Second World War broke out, the Nazis started to round up many important members of the French aristocracy when they occupied the country. The occupation of France shocked the world with how fast the German war machine could push through the lands, and it took the Allies by surprise, to the point they were pushed back to Dunkirk, and the British Expeditionary Force, along with other Allied soldiers, were rescued from the beaches. France was the largest military power forced under occupation, and it was occupied by the Wehrmacht. 100,000 German soldiers were sent to keep law and order, and when the Wehrmacht were fighting on the Eastern Front, German units were rotated to go to France to keep order but also rest. The number of soldiers in France did increase with the threat of an Allied invasion on the horizon, but the people were also kept quiet by the security forces that were infamous within Germany. The Gestapo and the SD both operated inside of France, and they would round up members of the resistance, and many of these were then subject to horrific torture. Many were then executed or were sent to concentration camps. The French resistance was rather effective in the land, and the Germans later launched huge anti-partisan activities against the resistance. They viewed every Frenchman and woman with suspicion, and to keep people in check, they carried out huge massacres of the French population. For example, at Oradour-sur-Glane, they reduced the whole village to a ghost town, killing pretty much everyone there. Resistance cells were made up of small groups of armed men and women who took part in guerrilla activities, attacks on German soldiers, and sabotage and destruction operations. They provided first-hand intelligence also to Allied units, and they also helped to free trapped Allied soldiers and airmen. The resistance was made up of people from all walks of life, and they had the sole goal of freeing France from occupation. They were important in the run-up and following the Normandy invasions, and they also attacked the Nazis' electrical power grids and transport facilities. This made them very feared and also sought after by the Germans, as they were considered dangerous and also a threat to the German war machine. Following the Normandy invasions, resistance was more organised, and the French partisan forces fought heavily to try and free their nation from the Germans. Members of the resistance were described as, it was hard to tell what they'd been through before German labour laws, threw them all together in the depths of the wild woods. Some had been shopkeepers, artisans, young sons of wealthy parents. Others were scrum of the gutter, and many were soldiers. Now, however, all were much the same. All wore the clothes, and many still the wooden clogs of peasants. Some lucky ones had scraps of uniforms and British battle dress, and predominantly their clothes consisted of drab-coloured shirts, blue overall trousers, and German field boots, whose owners no doubt had ceased to require them for obvious reasons. They wore neither brassards nor regular uniforms of any kind. The only distinguishable difference between the men of the Maquis and the men of the country from they had sprung from was a pistol cocked aggressively from their trouser tops, the rifle on their shoulder, the sten on their back, or the string of grenades on their belt. But Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay joined the French resistance, and despite her standing in society, she saw helping to free her nation as the most important thing that she could do. She had joined up before 1944, but it isn't mostly known what sort of activities she took part in. We know she was based in Paris and would have been part of the underground networks of resistance there, but a month after D-Day, Princess Anne was arrested by the Gestapo on the 6th of July 1944. Things inside of Paris were heating up for the Gestapo, and they tried incredibly hard to round up as many resistors as possible, and they also inflicted brutal torture onto their captives to extract information. Princess Anne was then transported to a nearby prison, which during the Second World War was used by the Germans to hold enemy spies and members of the resistance. Inside of Fresnes Prison, the conditions were horrific, and as mentioned, torture was administered so badly that a number of prisoners died there. As soon as the Allies broke through Normandy, the Gestapo then executed their prisoners there. Princess Anne was held here for 3 weeks, and was locked up and was tortured brutally, but she never gave over any information regarding resistance activities. Because of this, she was then deemed a lost cause, and on August 5, 1944, was deported on the last train to Ravensbruck Concentration Camp. Ravensbruck was an all-female camp, which was established in May 1939, and it was where 132,000 women found themselves in prison during the Second World War. Many prisoners were sent from different parts of the world to Ravensbrück, but here the conditions were truly terrible. It's believed that around 50,000 people were killed who were inmates at the camp, and most were killed by the conditions. One prisoner stated of life at Ravensbrück that, "They didn't shoot the women, we were to die of misery, hunger and exhaustion. When we arrived at Ravensbrück it was the worst. The first thing I saw was a cart with all the dead piled on it, their arms and legs hanging out, and mouths and eyes wide open. They reduced us to nothing. We didn't even feel like we had the value of cattle. You worked and you died." Medical experiments also took place there, but it was a place of great evil and cruelty. When Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay was transported to Ravensbrück, it's possible that she believed she would have been executed straight away. But when she got off the train, she would have been processed and allowed into the camp, and was most probably forced to conduct back-breaking work, like the women of Ravensbrück were forced to do so. However, as conditions at Ravensbrück got worse, and the camp's infrastructure and systems broke down, and overcrowding occurred, disease ran rampant across the site. Typhus, typhoid fever and other diseases killed hundreds each week, and Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay was killed by this. She contracted dysentery, which was very common, probably from eating contaminated food or drinking contaminated water out of desperation, and because of this she never recovered and succumbed to a horrific death around February and March 1945. Princess Anne de Beauffremont-Courtenay's story is one which is very tragic. Her story is one which is familiar with many of the women who were sent to Ravensbrück, as they succumbed to the evil and terrible conditions there. Thousands died at the camp in this manner, but what is incredible is that the princess saw her role in the war as fighting alongside the everyday man and woman to try and free France from the occupation. Her story is one which deserves to be more well known and should not be left untold. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.